Harold Thompson sat in his worn leather armchair, his weathered hands resting on the wooden arms that had smoothed over decades of use. At 93, his body might have grown slower, but his mind remained as sharp as the winter morning frost that covered his beloved garden outside. The morning sun streamed through his living room window, casting a warm glow on the collection of framed photographs that told the story of his life. Every morning at exactly 7:30 a.m., Harold would carefully button up his pressed plaid shirt, slip on his polished brown shoes, and place his veteran's cap proudly on his silver hair. His neighbors could set their watches by his routine, the gentle creak of his front door, the careful steps down his well-maintained porch, and the steady tap of his cane against the sidewalk as he made his way to Sally's Diner just 3 blocks away. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," called out little Jenny from next door, as she did every school day, her backpack bouncing as she ran to catch her bus. Harold would always stop, smile, and reach into his pocket for the butterscotch candy he kept especially for her. Some things, he believed, should never change. Sally's Diner had been his morning destination for the past 30 years. After Martha, his wife of 65 years, passed away 2 summers ago, these morning visits became more than just routine. They became his lifeline to the world. The bell above the door would chime as he entered, and before he could reach his usual booth by the window, Sally herself would already be approaching with his coffee, black, with just a touch of sugar. "The usual, Harold?" Sally would ask, though she already knew the answer. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a side of crispy bacon. It was the same breakfast he'd shared with Martha for countless mornings, and continuing it helped him feel like she was still somehow present in his life. Back home, Harold spent his days tending to his garden, a hobby that Martha had started but he had grown to love. His tomatoes were the pride of the neighborhood, and his roses made passers-by stop and admire their vibrant colors. Each plant had a story, a memory attached to it, and he cared for them as tenderly as he had once cared for his patients as a military medic during the war. His grandchildren would visit every Sunday, filling his quiet house with the chaos and joy that only young ones can bring. 7-year-old Tommy would always beg for war stories, but Harold was selective about what he shared. Instead, he told them about friendship, about loyalty, and about the importance of standing up for what's right. His stories were peppered with life lessons wrapped in adventures that made young eyes grow wide with wonder. In his study, hidden away in an old trunk, lay medals and commendations that spoke of heroism and sacrifice. But Harold never displayed them. "A true hero," he would say, "doesn't need to hang his courage on a wall." Instead, he kept Martha's photographs everywhere: their wedding day, family picnics, holiday celebrations, and quiet moments in their garden. These were the achievements he was most proud of. The neighborhood kids knew him as the kind old man who always had time to help fix a bicycle chain or offer advice about their growing vegetable patches. To the local shopkeepers, he was the gentleman who never failed to ask about their families and remember every detail they shared. And to the other veterans who sometimes joined him for coffee, he was a brother who understood the weight of memories they carried. Every evening, as the sun set, Harold would sit on his porch, a cup of tea in hand, Martha's favorite blend. He would watch the world slow down, wave to neighbors returning from work, and remember the full life he had lived. Sometimes, Mrs. Chen from across the street would bring him homemade dumplings, worried that he wasn't eating enough since Martha passed. He would accept them gratefully, knowing that it wasn't just about the food. It was about community, about belonging. As night fell, Harold would carefully lock his door, check his windows, old habits from wartime never really fade, and prepare for another day. On his nightstand sat a photograph of Martha, smiling at him from their 60th anniversary celebration. "Good night, my dear," he would whisper, just as he had done every night for the past 65 years. Even now, he could swear he sometimes heard her whisper back. In his quiet home, surrounded by memories and tended with care, Harold Thompson lived a life that was simple but rich with meaning. He had no way of knowing that his peaceful routine was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would test his patience, wisdom, and the strength that still lived within his aging frame. The first sign of change came on a Tuesday morning. Harold was walking his usual route to Sally's Diner when the ground beneath his feet trembled. The rumble of motorcycle engines echoed off the brick buildings, and the peaceful morning air filled with the roar of chrome exhaust pipes. 3 motorcycles zoomed past him, causing his veteran's cap to flutter in their wake. Outside the old Anderson warehouse, a building that had stood empty for nearly a decade, A group of men in leather vests were unloading boxes from a moving truck. Large banners were being hung across the building's facade, announcing the arrival of the Road Warriors MC. The once quiet street was now alive with activity, but not the kind that Harold or his neighbors had ever expected. Sally's face showed concern when Harold entered the diner that morning. "Did you see them?" she asked, pouring his coffee with slightly shaking hands. "They bought the warehouse last week, some motorcycle club from the city." Through the diner's wide windows, they watched as more motorcycles arrived, their chrome fixtures gleaming in the morning sun. Within days, the character of the neighborhood began to shift. The warehouse underwent a transformation. Security cameras appeared on corners. Heavy metal doors replaced the old wooden ones, and the sound of power tools competed with the constant rumble of motorcycles. The club members came and went at all hours, their loud bikes echoing through streets that had known only the quiet passage of family cars and children's bicycles. Mrs. Chen stopped walking to the market in the evenings, too intimidated by the groups of leather-clad men who gathered outside their clubhouse. The local children no longer played freely on the sidewalks, their parents calling them inside whenever the bikers roared past. Even Jenny, who had never missed giving Harold her morning greeting, now waited inside until her school bus arrived. Harold watched from his porch as his peaceful community changed. The air that once carried the scent of his roses now filled with exhaust fumes and cigarette smoke. The bikers seemed to take a particular interest in the building directly across from Sally's diner, installing bright floodlights that stayed on all night and setting up outdoor speakers that blasted heavy metal music during their weekend gatherings. One morning, Harold found Sally in tears. "They were in here last night," she explained, showing him the mess they'd left behind. Overturned sugar dispensers, coffee stains on the walls, and crude messages scratched into the wooden tabletops. "They said they're going to make this their regular spot. I can't afford to lose my regular customers, Harold." The local police patrol car drove by more frequently now, but they could do little without cause. "Just rowdy young men," Officer Martinez told Harold one afternoon. "As long as they're not breaking any laws, our hands are tied." But Harold could see the worry in the officer's eyes. They both knew that the presence of the motorcycle club was changing the neighborhood's atmosphere in ways that no law could address. The final straw came when Harold discovered his morning newspaper in the middle of the street, deliberately run over by motorcycle tires. It wasn't the first time. His mailbox had been knocked over twice that week, though he couldn't prove who had done it. But as he bent slowly to retrieve the muddy pages, a group of bikers watched from their clubhouse steps, laughing and pointing at his careful movements. That evening, as Harold sat in his study, he could hear the deep bass of their music vibrating his windows. The framed photo of Martha seemed to tremble on his desk. He picked it up, wiping the glass with his handkerchief. "What would you do, my dear?" he whispered to her smiling image. Martha had always been the diplomatic one, finding ways to bring people together even in the most difficult situations. Looking out his window at the transformed warehouse, Harold remembered the challenges he faced in his long life. The wars, the losses, the changes he witnessed in the world. This was different, though. This wasn't about fighting or confrontation. This was about his home, his community, and the peace that everyone deserved to enjoy in their golden years. As he prepared for bed that night, the rumble of motorcycles still echoing through his walls, Harold made a decision. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, he would take action. But first, he needed to visit his attic. There were some old boxes up there that might help him face this new challenge. Boxes he hadn't opened since 1945. The morning sun had barely risen when the first confrontation occurred. Harold was making his way to Sally's diner, his cane tapping steadily against the sidewalk, when three motorcycles deliberately revved their engines as they passed him. The sudden noise caused him to stumble slightly, and laughter erupted from the leather-clad riders. "Hey, old-timer," one of them called out, circling back on his bike. "Better watch your step. Wouldn't want you breaking a hip." More laughter followed as they roared away, leaving Harold to straighten his veteran's cap and gather his dignity. Inside Sally's diner, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The regular morning customers, Mr. Peterson from the hardware store, the Johnson sisters with their knitting, and the retired teachers' breakfast club, were noticeably absent. Instead, four bikers occupied the largest booth, their boots on the seats and cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling despite Sally's no smoking signs. "Your usual spot's taken, Gramps," one of them called out as Harold entered. Sally appeared quickly at Harold's side, her face tight with worry as she led him to a small table in the corner. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured his coffee, spilling a few drops on the tablecloth. "I'm so sorry, Harold," she whispered. "They've been here since dawn, threatening to trash the place if I don't serve them free coffee." Harold noticed fresh scratches on the counter where someone had carved initials with a knife. The harassment escalated over the next few days. Harold found his morning newspaper shredded and scattered across his front lawn. His garden fence, which he'd maintained meticulously for decades, was knocked over one night, crushing Martha's prized rose bushes beneath the splintered wood. Even walking to the corner store became an ordeal. The bikers would rev their engines when they saw him coming, sometimes riding up onto the sidewalk to force him to step aside. They made a game of it, betting among themselves on whether they could make the old man jump. One particularly hot afternoon, Harold was working in what remained of his garden when he heard the familiar rumble of motorcycles approaching. This time, they stopped in front of his house. 3 men dismounted, their boots crushing his remaining flowers as they walked up his path. "Nice garden you got here, old-timer," the tallest one said, kicking at a broken rose bush. He wore a leather vest with Road Warriors MC emblazoned across the back. Shame if anything else happened to it. Harold stood slowly, leaning on his garden trowel. "Those roses," he said quietly, "were my wife's." "Oh, you're the boys," the biker mocked. The old man's worried about his dead wife's flowers. He reached down and yanked up a handful of surviving blooms, tossing them at Harold's feet. That night, Harold sat in his study, looking at old photographs. One showed him standing proud in his military uniform, surrounded by his unit. Another captured him defusing a complex explosive device while under enemy fire. His fingers traced the edges of the Silver Star medal he'd earned that day. The final straw came the next morning. As Harold approached Sally's diner, he found the windows covered in graffiti. Crude words and symbols defaced the cheerful display that Sally's grandchildren had painted for spring. Through the smeared glass, he could see Sally inside, crying as she scrubbed futilely at the paint. But it was what he saw next that made his aged hands clench into fists. The bikers had spray-painted over the small Veterans Welcome sign that had hung in Sally's window since her father, a Korean War veteran, had opened the diner 40 years ago. Harold stood there for a long moment, his reflection ghosted in the vandalized glass. He saw not just an old man with a cane, but the soldier he'd once been, the man who'd led his unit through impossible situations, who'd saved lives and faced death with unwavering courage. That evening, as he locked his front door, Harold heard the bikers returning to their clubhouse, their engines echoing off the buildings like thunder. Music began to blast from their speakers, and raucous laughter filled the street. From his window, he watched them drinking and smoking, their shadows dancing in the harsh glare of their floodlights. Harold Thompson, veteran of World War II, recipient of the Silver Star, and widower of Martha Thompson, made his way slowly up to his attic. It was time to open those old boxes, to remember not just who he had been, but who he still was. The bikers had no idea what kind of man they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. In the dim light of his attic, Harold Thompson knelt beside a dusty wooden trunk he hadn't opened in decades. His fingers, though wrinkled with age, remembered the combination to the old brass lock, 08 to 1545, the date of Japan's surrender. As the lid creaked open, the musty smell of history filled the air. Inside, carefully preserved in an old ammunition box, lay the evidence of a life few in his quiet neighborhood could imagine. Harold lifted out his Silver Star, its surface still gleaming after all these years. Beneath it lay his other medals, the Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, and the Distinguished Service Cross that he'd earned for actions his military records listed only as classified operations. But it wasn't the medals that interested Harold now. His hands moved deliberately past them to find a worn leather folder marked Operation Shadow Wolf. Inside were yellowed photographs and documents that told the story of a very different Harold Thompson, not the gentle gardener his neighbors knew, but Lieutenant Harold Thompson, leader of an elite demolitions and strategy unit. One photograph showed a younger Harold, barely 30, standing beside a complex array of diffused German explosives. Another captured him teaching escape and evasion tactics to a group of resistance fighters in occupied France. Each image revealed a piece of his past that he'd kept hidden, like the tactical plans he'd drawn up for missions behind enemy lines. Lieutenant Thompson's unique approach to psychological warfare makes him invaluable to covert operations. Read one partially redacted report. Harold remembered the operations they were referring to, how his unit had managed to clear entire Nazi installations without firing a single shot, using carefully planned intimidation and strategic thinking instead of brute force. Among the papers was a letter from his commanding officer, General Matthews. Lieutenant Thompson's greatest strength lies not in his exceptional skills with explosives, but in his ability to think 3 steps ahead of the enemy. He understands that true victory often comes not from fighting, but from making your opponent realize that fighting is futile. Harold spread the documents across his attic floor, memories flooding back with each one he touched. There was the citation for the time he convinced an entire German garrison to surrender by making them believe they were surrounded by a much larger force, when in reality, he had only 8 men and some cleverly placed speakers broadcasting recorded tank sounds. A small notebook contained his personal observations on human psychology under pressure. Fear, he had written, is most effective when the target can't identify its source. Uncertainty becomes its own weapon. These principles had helped his small unit achieve objectives that much larger forces couldn't accomplish. As he continued through the trunk, Harold found his old field manual for demolitions and tactics. The margins were filled with his own notes, brilliant strategies that had saved countless lives by avoiding direct confrontation. He had learned early in the war that the most effective operations were often the ones where the enemy never knew what hit them until it was too late. At the bottom of the trunk lay his most prized possession, a group photograph of his entire unit, the Shadow Wolves, as they were unofficially known. These men had trusted him with their lives, following his unconventional plans without question because they knew he always thought through every detail, every possible outcome. Harold sat back in his old armchair, surrounded by the evidence of his hidden past. The loud music from the bikers' clubhouse filtered up through his floorboards, but now, instead of irritation, he felt something different stirring in his chest, the familiar sensation of his tactical mind beginning to work. On his lap lay a newspaper clipping from 1944. Allied forces secure strategic victory through cunning rather than force. The article didn't mention him by name. Such operations were never publicly credited, but he remembered how his unit had managed to disable an entire Nazi supply line without a single casualty on either side. Looking out his attic window at the bikers' clubhouse, Harold began to see it not as the source of his troubles, but as a tactical challenge to be solved. The same skills that had served him in wartime could be applied here: observation, psychology, strategy. The bikers thought they were dealing with a helpless old man, just as many German officers had underestimated the quiet lieutenant who'd ultimately outmaneuvered them. As night fell, Harold carefully returned everything to the trunk except for his tactical notebook and the letter from General Matthews. He might be older now, his hands might shake slightly when he pours his coffee, but his mind was as sharp as ever. The bikers had no idea that they'd awakened something in the old veteran, not anger, but a strategic brilliance that had once helped win a war. Tomorrow, Harold decided, it would be time to put some of his old skills to use. But first, he needed to make some observations, gather intelligence, and plan his approach, just as he had done so many years ago. Harold stood silently at his window, watching as the bikers defaced the veterans' memorial in the town square. Through his old military binoculars, he could see them spray-painting crude symbols over the names of fallen soldiers, laughing as they knocked over the flower arrangements left by families. His hands gripped the windowsill tightly, his knuckles turning white. Officer Martinez's patrol car arrived too late, as usual. The bikers had already scattered, leaving behind their destructive handiwork. Harold watched as the young officer took photos of the damage, shaking his head in frustration. It was the 3rd incident this week, and like the others, there would be no consequences. No witnesses were willing to come forward, and security cameras had mysteriously stopped working days ago. Later that morning, Harold made his way to the memorial. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the air as he stood before the defaced monument. Among the vandalized names, he found one that made his heart stop. Captain James Miller, his best friend who never made it home from Normandy. Jim's name was now barely visible under a layer of neon spray paint. Mrs. Miller, Jim's widow, arrived while Harold was there. She was 91 now, but she still brought fresh flowers every week. Seeing her face crumple at the sight of her husband's desecrated name was the moment something shifted inside Harold. He helped her place her flowers among the scattered arrangements, his military training already kicking in as he formulated a plan. That afternoon, Harold sat in Sally's diner, making careful notes in his small notebook. He'd spent 3 hours observing the bikers' patterns, when they arrived, when they left, who seemed to be in charge. Sally brought him endless cups of coffee, worried about the intense concentration on his face. "I haven't seen you look like this since you used to help plan the Memorial Day parades," she said, refilling his cup. Harold just nodded, his pen moving steadily across the page as he documented the bikers' routines and vulnerabilities. The club members had fallen into predictable patterns, just like the German units he'd studied during the war. They were loudest and most aggressive on Friday nights. Their leader, a tall man with a snake tattoo on his neck, always parked his bike in the same spot. Most importantly, Harold noted, they were overconfident. They never considered that anyone would dare to challenge them. As evening approached, Harold made his way to the police station. Officer Martinez was at his desk, surrounded by paperwork from the memorial vandalism. The young officer looked up in surprise as Harold carefully laid out his military service records and combat photographs on the desk. "Sir," Martinez said, studying the documents with growing respect, "I had no idea. But why are you showing me this now?" Harold's voice was steady as he explained his plan. He wasn't proposing violence or revenge. He'd seen enough of that in the war. Instead, he outlined a strategy that would use the bikers' own tactics against them, a psychological operation that would make them rethink their behavior without a single punch being thrown. "It's not just about stopping them," Harold explained, pointing to his silver star. "It's about making them understand what they're really doing. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make sure it never happens." Officer Martinez listened intently as Harold detailed his strategy. The old veteran's plan was brilliant in its simplicity, using the same principles that had helped him outmaneuver much larger forces during the war. By the end of the meeting, Martinez was nodding in agreement, a new respect in his eyes for the elderly man he'd previously seen as just another concerned citizen. That night, Harold returned home and opened his tactical notebook one last time. His old training told him that timing would be crucial. The bikers had chosen this quiet neighborhood thinking they'd found an easy target, a community too weak or frightened to stand up to them. They had no idea they were dealing with a man who had once orchestrated operations that changed the course of battles. As he made his final preparations, Harold looked at Martha's photograph on his bedside table. "You always said every problem has a solution," he whispered to her image. "And sometimes the best solutions come from understanding your opponent, not fighting them." Tomorrow would be the day everything changed. Harold Thompson, the quiet veteran who tended his roses and fed the neighborhood birds, would show these young troublemakers that true strength isn't about intimidation. It's about strategy, wisdom, and knowing exactly when and how to make your move. On Saturday morning, Harold put on his old military uniform. It still fit, though a bit loosely now. He carefully pinned his medals to his chest, the Silver Star, Bronze Star, and Purple Hearts gleaming in the early sunlight. Under his arm, he carried a worn leather briefcase filled with photographs, documents, and maps from his service days. At exactly 10 a.m., when he knew the bikers would be gathering for their weekend meetup, Harold walked straight to the clubhouse door. The young men lounging outside fell silent as they saw him approach, their usual smirks fading at the sight of his decorated uniform. "I'd like to speak with your leader," Harold said, his voice carrying the same command it had held when directing troops through enemy territory. The bikers exchanged uncertain glances, thrown off by this unexpected version of the old man they'd been tormenting. Inside the clubhouse, Snake, as the leader was known, sat at a makeshift bar, his snake tattoo visible under the fluorescent lights. He turned, ready to intimidate this intruder, but stopped short when he saw Harold's medals. "You boys have been trying to get my attention," Harold said calmly, placing his briefcase on the bar. "Now you have it." He began laying out photographs, images of himself leading combat missions, defusing bombs under enemy fire, standing with his unit beside destroyed German tanks. The bikers gathered around, their usual bravado replaced by curious silence. Harold pointed to a photograph of his unit. "These men," he said, "were the original road warriors. We didn't need motorcycles to prove our strength. We proved it by saving lives." Snake picked up a photo showing Harold's team rescuing civilians from a bombed-out French village. "This is real?" he asked, his tough guy facade cracking slightly. "April 1944, Harold replied. "We saved 23 children that day." He then pulled out a particular photograph that made Snake freeze. It showed a young soldier standing beside a tank, grinning at the camera. "That man," Snake whispered, "looks exactly like my grandfather." Harold nodded slowly. "Sergeant Mike Snake Peterson, the original Snake. He was one of my best men." He watched as the color drained from the biker leader's face. "He got that nickname because he could slip behind enemy lines like a ghost. He saved my life twice." The clubhouse had grown completely silent. Snake stared at the photograph of his grandfather, a man he'd never met but whose nickname he'd adopted without knowing its true meaning. "He died last year," Snake said quietly. "I never knew. He never talked about the war." Harold pulled out more photos, documents, and stories. He showed them how his unit had earned their reputation not through intimidation, but through courage, strategy, and protecting others. He told them about the real meaning of brotherhood, not about terrorizing communities, but about standing together to defend them. As the morning turned to afternoon, the atmosphere in the clubhouse transformed. The bikers sat around Harold, asking questions about their own grandfathers and great-uncles who had served. Some discovered that their relatives had fought in units that Harold's team had supported. "Your grandfather," Harold told Snake, "would be heartbroken to see his nickname used to frighten elderly women and vandalize memorials bearing his friends' names." Snake stood up suddenly, moving to a wall where hung the club's Road Warriors banner. With a swift motion, he tore it down. "We need a new name," he announced to his fellow bikers. "One we actually deserve." Harold watched as these young men, whom he'd seen as enemies just hours ago, began to understand the true meaning of strength and honor. He saw in their eyes the same look he'd seen in young soldiers during the war, the desire to be part of something bigger than themselves, to stand for something meaningful. Before leaving, Harold placed one last item on the bar, the recent photograph of the vandalized Veterans Memorial. "Your grandfather's name is on that wall too, Snake, next to the names of men who died saving his life." The effect was immediate. Snake gathered his men, and within an hour, they were at the memorial with cleaning supplies, carefully restoring what they had damaged. Harold stood back, watching as these former tormentors worked to make things right, understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemy, but from turning them into allies. As he walked home that evening, Harold heard motorcycles behind him, but this time, instead of fear or anger, he felt hope. The roar of engines had become not a sound of intimidation, but a reminder that even the hardest hearts can change when they learn the true meaning of their own heritage. The transformation of the Road Warriors happened faster than anyone in the neighborhood could believe. The morning after Harold's visit to the clubhouse, Snake called an emergency meeting of all club members. Standing before his fellow bikers, he held up the photograph of his grandfather, the original Snake, and shared everything he had learned. "From this day forward," Snake announced, his voice thick with emotion, "we're changing our name to the Veterans Legacy Riders." The suggestion was met with unanimous approval, especially after several other members discovered their own connections to Harold's wartime unit through their grandparents. Word spread quickly through the small town. People stopped in their tracks, amazed to see the once feared bikers repainting their clubhouse, removing the intimidating black paint and replacing it with dignified navy blue. The skull and crossbones logo was replaced with a new design, a motorcycle wheel intertwined with a military service medal. Mrs. Chen, who had been afraid to walk past the clubhouse, found herself being greeted respectfully by the same men who had once scared her. One morning, she was struggling with heavy grocery bags when two of the bikers rushed to help her. From that day on, they made it their mission to ensure she got home safely with her shopping every week. The biggest surprise came when Snake discovered more about his grandfather's history. Through Harold's old military contacts, they located Sergeant Peterson's military records, revealing a Silver Star citation that had never been claimed. The award ceremony was held at the newly restored Veterans Memorial, with Harold proudly pinning the medal on Snake's leather vest, now cleaned and adorned with respectful patches honoring veterans. Sally's Diner became the unofficial meeting place for an extraordinary gathering, elderly veterans sharing war stories with young bikers who hung on every word. The booth that had once been defaced with knife marks was now carefully restored and reserved for these daily meetings of different generations. Your grandfather, Harold told Snake one morning over coffee, would stand guard all night so the rest of us could sleep. He said he did it because we were his family. Snake nodded, understanding now why he had always felt drawn to the idea of brotherhood, even if he had initially expressed it in the wrong way. The veterans' legacy riders began escorting elderly veterans to medical appointments, their motorcycles forming an honor guard that brought tears to observers' eyes. They organized weekly maintenance sessions at the Veterans Memorial, ensuring that no name would ever be disrespected again. Little Jenny, who had once been afraid to walk past the clubhouse, now waited eagerly each morning to wave at the bikers. They had become her unofficial protectors, making sure she got to her school bus safely. Snake himself would sometimes share butterscotch candies with her, having learned the tradition from Harold. One Saturday morning, Harold arrived at his garden to find the entire motorcycle club there, ready to help rebuild what they had destroyed. They worked alongside him, learning the names of different roses and hearing stories about Martha's love for gardening. By sunset, the garden was more beautiful than ever, with new varieties of roses planted in honor of fallen veterans. The transformation extended beyond the neighborhood. Other motorcycle clubs in the region heard about the change and were inspired to connect with their own community's veterans. The Veterans Legacy Riders began organizing multi-club rides to raise funds for veterans' causes, with Harold riding in a specially modified sidecar as their guest of honor. Officer Martinez couldn't believe the change in his daily reports. Instead of complaints about noise and vandalism, he was receiving messages of thanks for the bikers' community service. The young officer often stopped by the clubhouse himself, not to check for trouble, but to hear Harold's stories about tactical planning and strategic thinking. The most touching moment came when Snake discovered a box of his grandfather's belongings in his mother's attic. Among the items was a faded photograph showing his grandfather standing next to a young Harold Thompson, both men smiling after a successful mission. Snake had it framed and hung it prominently in the clubhouse, a reminder of the real legacy they were now carrying forward. As Harold sat in his usual spot at Sally's diner one morning, watching Snake teach younger club members about proper flag etiquette for their memorial rides, he smiled. Martha would have loved this, he thought. She always said that everyone deserves a chance to change, to find their better selves. Looking at these former troublemakers who had become protectors of the community, Harold knew she had been right. What had started as a confrontation had become something none of them expected, a bridge between generations, a restoration of honor, and a reminder that it's never too late to choose a better path. 1 year had passed since Harold first walked into the bikers' clubhouse with his briefcase of memories. The neighborhood had transformed into something even better than before, a place where the rumble of motorcycles now brought smiles instead of fear. On this particular Sunday morning, Harold stood proudly in his garden, watching as dozens of motorcycles lined up along his street. The Veterans Legacy Riders were preparing for their first annual Veterans Honor Ride, an event that had drawn motorcycle clubs from 3 neighboring states. Each bike gleamed in the morning sun, decorated with American flags and military branch insignias. Snake, wearing his grandfather's restored military jacket over his leather vest, approached Harold with a special surprise. The club had commissioned a custom sidecar for Harold's participation in the ride, painted in his unit's colors and equipped with comfortable seating that accommodated his age. On its side, they had painted Lieutenant Thompson's chariot in elegant gold letters. "You changed our lives, sir," Snake said, helping Harold into the sidecar. "Today, we show everyone what real brotherhood means." The old veteran smiled, noting how Snake's voice had lost its harsh edge over the past year, replaced by a tone of genuine respect and purpose. Mrs. Chen stood on her porch, waving as the bikers prepared to leave. She had prepared lunchboxes for everyone, following Harold's old military recipes that he had shared during their weekly community dinners. The Johnson sisters, who had once been too frightened to walk past the clubhouse, now sat in their front yard selling hand-knitted riding gloves to the visiting bikers. Little Jenny, no longer afraid, ran up to present Harold with a drawing she had made. It showed him in his military uniform standing beside a group of bikers, all of them protecting the Veterans Memorial together. Harold carefully folded it and placed it in his breast pocket, right next to his silver star. Sally had opened her diner early that morning, serving free breakfast to all participating riders. The walls of her restaurant now displayed photographs of local veterans alongside pictures of the Veterans Legacy Riders doing community service. The booth where Harold sat every morning had been officially dedicated to him, with a small plaque reading, "Reserved for heroes, past, present, and future." As the ride began, Harold sat proudly in his sidecar, attached to Snake's motorcycle. They led a procession of over 200 bikes through town, past the Veterans Memorial, now beautifully maintained with fresh flowers planted by the riders themselves. People lined the streets, cheering and waving flags as the parade of motorcycles thundered past. The ride's destination was the state veterans' home, where the bikers had organized a barbecue for elderly veterans. Harold watched with pride as his unlikely brotherhood served food, shared stories, and showed sincere respect to men and women who had served their country. Snake spent hours recording the stories of World War II veterans, creating an oral history project to preserve their memories. That evening, back at Harold's house, the bikers gathered in his garden for a special ceremony. They had secretly restored Martha's garden bench, the one that had been damaged during their troublemaking days. Now it stood beautifully refinished, with a small brass plaque that read, "In memory of Martha Thompson, who taught us all to grow." Officer Martinez, now a regular at their community events, presented Harold with a civilian service award from the police department. "You didn't just stop the trouble," he said. "You showed us all how to turn enemies into family." As the sun set, Harold sat on Martha's bench, surrounded by his unusual new family. The Veterans Legacy Riders had become more than just a motorcycle club. They were guardians of memory, protectors of community, and proof that it's never too late to learn the true meaning of respect and honor. Snake sat next to Harold, holding the photograph of their grandfathers together. "You know," he said quietly, "I finally understand what my grandfather meant when he wrote in his diary about the real meaning of strength. It's not about making others fear you, it's about being someone they can count on." Harold nodded, looking out over his garden where tough-looking bikers were carefully tending to Martha's roses. The evening air was filled not with the angry roar of motorcycles, but with laughter, conversation, and the sound of genuine brotherhood. As stars began appearing in the sky, Harold thought about how life's greatest victories often come in unexpected ways. He had set out to stop a group of troublemakers but had instead gained a family, proving that sometimes the best solutions come not from confrontation, but from helping others discover their own capacity for good.